Chapter 1. A Debt and a Discovery. The carriage of the Duke of Montfaucon struggled along the steep path leading to the hamlet of Three Oaks, its wheels sinking into mud after the previous day's torrential rains. Inside, Armand de Montfaucon, the third of his name, watched with growing irritation as the rustic landscape slowly passed before his eyes. At 38, the Duke was not accustomed to venturing into the most remote corners of his domain, preferring the sophistication of Paris, or the comfort of his chateau. "How much longer, Dufresne?" he asked his steward, a corpulent man with salt and pepper sideburns who nervously consulted his pocket watch. "Less than a league, Your Grace. We should reach Widow Mercier's cottage before noon." The Duke sighed, adjusting his fine leather gloves. This expedition seemed increasingly a waste of time, but it was a matter he had to settle personally. The death of his uncle Henri 3 months earlier had left behind a tangle of debts and obligations that Armand was inheriting much against his will. Among the papers discovered in the deceased's office was an acknowledgement of debt to a certain François Mercier, a gamekeeper who had died the previous winter in a hunting accident. "Remind me of the details of this affair," the Duke ordered, more to break the heavy silence than out of real interest. Dufresne cleared his throat. "According to the documents, your uncle had borrowed a considerable sum from François Mercier, 2,000 livres, 5 years ago. The money apparently came from a family inheritance of the gamekeeper. Your uncle had promised to repay with interest, but he did nothing of the sort," the Duke finished sharply, "as with so many other debts. My uncle always had a particular talent for squandering other people's money." The memory of his Uncle Henri evoked in Armand a mixture of contempt and annoyance. An inveterate gambler, a seducer with a sulphurous reputation, Henri de Montfaucon had spent his life escaping his creditors and tarnishing, by his behavior, the honor of a family whose name dated back to the Crusades. "The sum, with interest, now amounts to nearly 3,000 livres, Dufresne specified, "a fortune for a simple gamekeeper's widow." "And that's precisely why we're making this journey," replied the Duke. "The Montfaucon family always honors its debts, even those contracted by its less responsible members." In truth, Armand could simply have sent his steward to settle the matter. But something about this story intrigued him. How could a simple gamekeeper have lent such a sum, even inherited? And why had his uncle, who usually borrowed from Parisian usurers, approached a servant of his own domain? The carriage slowed, then stopped. The coachman announced their arrival at the hamlet of Three Oaks, a modest grouping of about 20 cottages surrounding a small square where a communal well stood. The villagers froze at the sight of the imposing armored equipage, some bowing respectfully, others watching with undisguised curiosity. "The widow's cottage is at the edge of the hamlet," indicated Dufresne, consulting his notes, "the last house before the forest." The Duke descended from the carriage, refusing his valet's help with a gesture. Despite the simplicity of his traveling outfit, a fine wool coat in midnight blue, deerskin breeches and impeccably polished boots, his aristocratic appearance immediately designated him as a man of high birth. Tall, with a proud bearing, regular features framed by short chestnut hair cut according to the fashion of the moment, Armand de Montfaucon embodied the natural authority characteristic of those who had commanded all their lives. "Wait for me. Here," he ordered his people. "This interview should not take more than a quarter of an hour." As he set off, with a determined step on the path leading to the last cottage, the Duke noticed that it, although modest, distinguished itself from the other dwellings in the hamlet. A carefully maintained garden surrounded it, overflowing with vegetables and medicinal plants. The whitewashed walls were clean, and curtains of surprising whiteness adorned the small windows. Smoke escaped from the chimney, carrying a smell of fresh bread that reminded the Duke that he had eaten nothing since dawn. As he was about to knock on the simple but sturdy wooden door, it suddenly opened, revealing a boy of about 8 who froze at the sight of the imposing visitor. "Pardon, sir," stammered the child, his large brown eyes wide. "I am looking for Madame Mercier," announced the Duke, surprised by this unexpected encounter. "Mother Mercier is inside, sir," replied the boy, regaining a little confidence. "She's finishing serving the meal." The meal. The Duke glanced at his watch. It wasn't yet noon. "For the little ones who go to the quarry in the afternoon," explained the child, as if it were obvious. "I don't go yet. I'm too small. But Simon and Thomas go, so they eat before." Before Armand could ask who these children were that the boy was talking about, a clear and melodious voice rang out from inside. "Lucien, who are you talking to, my little one?" "A very well-dressed, tall gentleman, Mother Mercier," cried the boy in return. "He wants to see you." "Show him in, of course. We don't leave people at the door." The Duke thus found himself invited with an awkward gesture by an 8-year-old child into what proved to be the most surprising interior he had ever seen in a peasant cottage. The main room, though small, was remarkably clean and orderly. A pyre danced in the hearth, above which hung a cauldron from which escaped an appetizing aroma of herb soup. A large wooden table occupied the center, surrounded by benches on which sat 5 children of different ages, from perhaps 5 to 12 years, all eating with evident appetite bowls of soup accompanied by slices of fresh bread. And standing, serving them additional portions, was a woman whose sight struck the Duke with unexpected force. She must have been about 30, although her face retained a youthful freshness despite evident traces of fatigue. Her auburn hair was simply tied in a bun, from which escaped a few rebellious strands. She wore a grey woolen dress, plain but immaculate, with a white apron that emphasized the fineness of her waist. But it was her eyes that immediately captivated. Armand, a deep and luminous green, they seemed to contain both infinite gentleness and steely determination. "Good day, sir," she said, quickly wiping her hands on her apron. "I am Claire Mercier. What can I do for you?" Her voice, devoid of the pronounced local accent, betrayed an education that seemed out of place for a gamekeeper's wife. As did her bearing, imbued with a natural dignity that would have done honor to a lady of the court. "Armand de Montfaucon." The Duke introduced himself, surprised to feel obliged to incline his head slightly in greeting, a gesture he usually reserved for ladies of his rank. "I have come regarding a matter between my uncle, Henri de Montfaucon, and your late husband." A flash of recognition crossed Claire Mercier's gaze, quickly replaced by an indecipherable expression. "I see," she said simply. Then, turning to the children, "Older ones, finish your meal and accompany the little ones to Mother Lisette's. Thomas, don't forget your hat. The sun is strong today. Jeanne, make sure Marie takes her tisane for her cough." The children complied with surprising discipline, gathering their things and leaving the cottage not without casting curious glances at the distinguished visitor. Little Lucien was the last to leave, visibly reluctant to miss what promised to be an interesting conversation. Once alone, Claire Mercier invited the Duke to sit at the table, which she was efficiently clearing. "Forgive the disturbance, Your Grace," she said. "I wasn't expecting such an eminent visit." Those children. Armand began, still disconcerted by the scene he had just observed. "Are they yours?" A fleeting smile softened Claire's face. "No, Your Grace. With the exception of Lucien, whom you met upon arriving, they are orphans from the hamlet and surroundings. They come to take their meals here when their guardians work in the fields or at the quarry." "You feed orphans?" The surprise was evident in the Duke's voice. "Out of charity." "Out of necessity, sir," she replied simply. "These children have no one else." Their parents died of the fever last autumn, or from accidents at the quarry. Those who have taken them in are too poor or too busy to care for them properly. The Duke observed the small cottage with fresh eyes. Despite its simplicity, everything, and breathed care and attention. Bunches of dried herbs hung from the beams. Books, a surprising fact in a peasant home, were carefully arranged on a shelf, and in one corner he noticed a small loom with a work in progress. "Madame Mercier," he finally said, returning to the object of his visit, "I have come to bring you what is due to you. My uncle borrowed a considerable sum from your husband, and the Montfaucon family honors its debts. He took from his inner pocket a leather purse that clinked heavily when he placed it on the table. 3,000 livres, comprising the capital and interest calculated according to the terms of the acknowledgement of debt signed by my uncle." Claire looked at the purse, without making a move to take it. Her green eyes slowly rose to the Duke, filled with an expression he could not decipher. "Your Grace," she said softly, "this debt has a history that you may not be aware of." Armand raised an eyebrow. His interest piqued. "Enlighten me, then." Claire seemed to hesitate, as if carefully weighing her words. "The 2,000 livres that my husband lent to your uncle did not exactly come from a family inheritance, as he may have claimed. Where did they come from, then? From you, Your Grace." The silence that followed this declaration was almost palpable. Armand stared at Claire Mercier, searching in her expression for the slightest sign of deception, but found only a quiet sincerity. "Explain yourself, madame," he finally said in a contained voice. Claire rose and went to a small wooden chest placed on a dresser. She took out a carefully folded document, which she handed to the Duke. "7 years ago, you ordered the steward preceding Monsieur Dufresne to pay a reward of 2,000 livres to anyone who provided information leading to the arrest of a band of poachers who were decimating your forests. My husband, then the chief gamekeeper, succeeded in identifying them and facilitating their capture. Here is the official letter granting him this reward." Armand examined the document. It was indeed his seal and signature, affixed to a letter written by his former steward, indeed promising the sum mentioned. "But this reward should have been paid immediately," he objected. "Why would your husband then have lent this money to my uncle?" Claire's face darkened slightly. "Because the reward was never paid, Your Grace. Your steward at the time, Monsieur Béranger, claimed that the estate's coffers were momentarily empty and that we had to wait. Months passed, and still nothing. Then your uncle proposed to François to sign a formal acknowledgement of debt with interest in exchange for abandoning his claim against you." "Béranger," murmured the Duke, a cold anger rising within him. His former steward, dismissed for embezzlement 3 years earlier, had manifestly committed more misdeeds than he had suspected. And my uncle took advantage of the situation to divert a reward that was not intended for him. "I pass no judgment, Your Grace," Claire said gently. "Your uncle acted with honesty in signing this acknowledgement of debt. It's more than many others would have done." Armand observed the widow with renewed curiosity. Instead of the bitterness he would have expected, she displayed a remarkable equanimity. Even more surprising was the fact that she had essentially just told him that the debt he had come to pay did not really exist, that the money had legitimately belonged to her from the beginning. "Madame Mercier," he said slowly, "you are telling me that I do not have to pay this debt, since the money was already yours by right." "Technically, yes," she admitted. "But I wanted you to know the truth." The Duke rose and took a few steps in the small room, thinking intensely. Everything about this situation was unexpected. The revelation about the origin of the debt, the disarming honesty of this woman, and above all, the spectacle of this apparently resourceless widow feeding orphans in her modest cottage. "These children that you feed," he suddenly asked, "how many are there exactly?" Claire appeared surprised by this change of subject. 12 in total, Your Grace, 8 who come regularly for meals, and 4 older ones who occasionally stop by for a bowl of soup or advice. And you do this with what resources? A slight smile touched Claire's lips. My garden provides the essentials. Sir, the vegetables, the medicinal herbs that I sometimes sell at the Saint-Maur market. I also do sewing work for some families in the town, and I weave fabrics when I have the time. That's hardly sufficient to feed so many mouths, observed the Duke. We manage, Your Grace, she replied simply, with a dignity that forced his respect. These children need someone, and I am here. Armand returned to the table and picked up the purse he had deposited there. Then in a deliberate gesture, he held it out to Claire. This money belongs to you, Madame Mercier, not as repayment of a debt, but as a late payment of a reward amply earned by your husband. The added interest poorly compensates for the delay. I am aware, but I hope it will help you in your charitable work. Claire hesitated, then accepted the purse with a slightly trembling hand. Thank you, Your Grace. This money will be well used, I assure you. I do not doubt it for an instant, replied Armand, surprised by the sincerity of his own words. As he prepared to take his leave, a cry rang out outside, followed by the sound of a precipitous race. The door flew open, revealing Lucien, pale-faced, and looking panicked. Mother Mercier, quick, it's little Jules, he's fallen in the quarry. Without a moment's hesitation, Claire Mercier rushed to a cupboard from which she took out a basket containing bandages and various vials. Her movements were rapid but methodical, testifying to a habit born of experience. Where is he exactly? Lucien? She asked, her voice calm despite the obvious urgency of the situation. On the eastern ledge, the one they call the Perch, replied the boy, panting. Thomas says he's bleeding a lot from the head and can't move his leg. The Duke, who had witnessed this scene with astonishment, suddenly intervened. My carriage is in the square. It will take you there much faster than you could go on foot. Claire raised a grateful look toward him. Thank you, Your Grace. I accept your offer. In a few moments, all three found themselves in the ducal carriage, speeding toward the stone quarry located at the edge of the hamlet. Dufresne, the steward, observed with undisguised surprise his master seated alongside a simple gamekeeper's widow, but he was too well-bred to make any remark. Is this quarry safe for children? Asked Armand, as the vehicle jolted along the stony path. Absolutely not, replied Claire, her face betraying a worry she was trying to master. That's why I strictly forbid the little ones to venture there. But Jules, that boy has always been reckless. He just turned 7 and thinks himself invincible. The carriage stopped at the foot of a steep hill cut by the stone exploitation. Irregular tiers marked the side of the quarry, some wide and accessible, others narrow and perilous. A group of children and a few adults were gathered at the foot of a particularly steep wall, anxiously looking upward. Claire descended precipitately, followed by the Duke who, driven by an instinct he could not explain himself, had decided to accompany this extraordinary woman. Where is he? She asked a boy of about 12 who seemed to be the leader of the group. Thomas, the Duke guessed. The boy pointed toward a narrow ledge situated about 50 feet up. Up there, Mother Mercier. We tried to reach him, but it's too dangerous. Simon's father has gone to fetch ropes from the village. Armand followed the indicated direction and saw, with a tightening heart, the motionless silhouette of a small boy lying on a rocky projection, barely wide enough to contain his frail body. A dark stain, blood, he realized with horror, was visible even from that distance. Without hesitation, Claire headed toward the wall, quickly examining the possible holds. I'm going up, she announced firmly. Jules's condition doesn't allow us to wait for the ropes. It's madness, exclaimed a middle-aged man who seemed to be a quarry worker. That wall is treacherous, madame. Even our experienced stonecutters don't risk it without equipment. I have no choice, she replied simply. "This child is under my responsibility." As she was about to begin the ascent, the Duke placed a hand on her arm. "Allow me," he said in a voice that admitted no reply. "I am used to climbing. In my youth I scaled cliffs far more perilous than this one." Claire looked at him with surprise, then gratitude. "But your grace, your rank, your safety." "My rank commands me to protect those who depend on me," he replied with a conviction that surprised even himself. "And this child lives on my lands, which makes him my responsibility." Without waiting for a response, Armand removed his frock coat and handed it to Dufresne, who had approached, looking deeply concerned. "Your Grace, I implore you, wait for the men with the ropes." "No time," cut the Duke. Turning to Claire, "What should I know about the child's injuries before moving him?" Claire, understanding that it was useless to argue, quickly conveyed the essential precautions. "If he has a head injury, don't shake him. First check if he's conscious. If his leg is broken, try to immobilize it with your cravat before moving him." Armand nodded, memorizing these instructions, then approached the wall. With surprising agility for a man of his rank, he began to climb the rock, quickly identifying the safest holds. His youthful years spent hunting in the mountains of his property in Savoy had given him valuable experience he never thought he would put to use in this way. The climb was perilous, the stone made slippery by the residual moisture from recent rains offered few reliable holds. Several times Armand felt his foot slip, catching himself just in time on an outcrop. Below, he vaguely heard the anxious whispers of the crowd that had grown larger, but he remained focused on his task, methodically, progressing toward the ledge where the child lay. After what seemed like an eternity, he finally reached the narrow edge. The little boy, Jules, was lying on his back, unconscious, a trickle of dried blood barring his pale forehead. His right leg formed a disturbing angle that left no doubt about the fracture. "Jules," the Duke called softly, placing a cautious hand on the child's shoulder. "Can you hear me, my boy?" The little one's eyelids fluttered, then opened, revealing brown eyes misted with pain and confusion. Who are you?" he whispered weakly. "A friend of Mother Mercier," replied Armand, relieved to see the child conscious. "I've come to get you. Does your leg hurt?" "A lot," admitted the boy with a brave grimace. "I fell, trying to catch a bird's nest to show to Lucien." "That was brave, but imprudent," said the Duke gently while undoing his fine silk cravat. "Now I'm going to have to move your leg to tie it, and it will hurt. Are you ready?" The little one nodded, gritting his teeth with touching determination. Armand proceeded as delicately as possible, using his cravat to immobilize the fractured leg against the sound one. Despite his precautions, Jules let out a cry of pain that echoed in the quarry, making all anxious gazes turn toward them. "Well, done," the Duke congratulated him. "You're as brave as a soldier. Now, I'm going to carry you, but you'll have to hold firmly to my neck. Can you do that?" "Yes, sir," replied Jules, his eyes filled with an absolute confidence that strangely moved the Duke. With infinite caution, Armand lifted the child and positioned him on his back, the frail but determined little arms clinging firmly to his neck. The descent would be even more perilous than the ascent, he realized, assessing the path to travel. With the child's weight and the impossibility of freely using both hands, each movement would have to be calculated with absolute precision. "Hold tight, Jules," he murmured. "We're going home." The descent was an exercise in will and precision. Like Armand had never known, each hold had to be tested, each step assured before trusting it. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool air, and his muscles protested under the unusual effort. Yet he progressed, inch by inch, guided by a determination he didn't know he possessed. Halfway down, a fragment of rock gave way under his hand, dangerously unbalancing him. A collective cry rose from the crowd below. For a terrible moment, the Duke thought they would both topple into the void. but his foot miraculously found a solid projection, and he managed to stabilize himself, his heart pounding furiously. "Are you all right, sir?" whispered Jules against his ear, his voice trembling but brave. "Perfectly fine," Armand reassured him, touched by the child's concern for him, despite his own pain. "We're almost there." Indeed, a few minutes later, they reached the foot of the wall, where Claire and the villagers awaited them, their faces marked with obvious relief, hands stretched out to help them in the last meters, and soon Jules was gently laid on an improvised stretcher where Claire hurried to examine his injuries. Armand, exhausted but strangely exalted, observed the scene with a new detachment. His clothes were torn and covered with dust, his hands were scraped and bleeding in places, and yet he had never felt so alive, so useful as in this moment. "Your Grace," murmured Dufresne, handing him his frock coat, looking deeply troubled, "allow me to say that your act of bravery was extraordinary but terribly risky. If you had fallen—" "But I didn't fall, Dufresne," replied the Duke with a slight smile. "And a child is saved. Isn't that what matters?" The steward opened his mouth to respond, but was interrupted by Claire's approach, her green gaze bright with intense emotion. "Your Grace," she said softly, "I have no words to express my gratitude. You risked your life to save Jules." "I did what anyone would have done," he replied, embarrassed by her gratitude. "How is he?" "His leg is cleanly broken, and he has a slight concussion, but he will recover completely thanks to you. He will have to remain bedridden for several weeks, but—" She broke off, a shadow suddenly passing over her face. "But," the Duke gently encouraged. Claire hesitated, then admitted in a low voice, "Jules has been an orphan for 6 months. He lives with his uncle, who works from sunrise to sunset at the sawmill. There is no one to take care of him during his convalescence." Armand understood immediately. "You're going to take him into your home." It was not a question, but a statement. Claire nodded, a mixture of determination and concern in her eyes. "With the money you gave me today, I can hire someone to help me and arrange a space for him. It's Providence that brought you to my door this morning, Your Grace," Armand observed. "This remarkable woman who, with so few means, accomplished so much. A widow who, instead of feeling sorry for herself, had chosen to devote her life to the abandoned children of this forgotten corner of his domain. A woman who, manifestly educated and refined, lived in a simple cottage to be close to those who needed her. A sudden decision formed in his mind, impulsive perhaps, but with a rightness that seemed obvious to him. "Madame Mercier," he said formally, "I would like to make you a proposal." Claire looked at him with curiosity, waiting for him to continue. "The gamekeeper's lodge, at the edge of the domain forest, has been empty since your husband's death. It's a solid construction, with 6 rooms and a garden much larger than that of your current cottage. It's located less than a league from the hamlet, but would offer much more space for your work." Claire's eyes widened with surprise. "You're offering me the lodge, Your Grace?" "Not exactly," Armand specified. "I'm proposing an arrangement. The estate sorely lacks a structure for orphans. These children whom you feed and educate represent the future of these lands. I wish to officially establish a home for them under your direction, with regular financial support from the estate." Claire seemed to have difficulty assimilating this unexpected proposal. An official home for orphans. "With all that implies," confirmed the Duke, "a salary for you and for the assistance you will need, funds for food, clothing, and even education for the most gifted. These children deserve better than to end up as quarry workers or farm servants by default." A light kindled in Claire's eyes, a light of hope so intense that Armand was deeply touched. "Why would you do this?" she asked softly. "You didn't know me this morning. These children are nothing to you." The Duke reflected for a moment, trying himself to understand the deep motivations of his gesture. "Perhaps because I discovered today an injustice on my lands. Not only the unpaid debt to your husband, but also the situation of these children, left to themselves when they live under my theoretical protection." He took a few steps, observing. The stretcher where Jules, now asleep thanks to a calming tisane administered by Claire, rested peacefully. "Or perhaps," he added more softly, "because I saw an extraordinary woman accomplish with almost nothing what my fortune and influence had never thought to undertake. You have opened my eyes, Madame Mercier." Claire remained silent for a moment, her gaze passing from the gathered children to the Duke, as if she were evaluating the implications of this proposal that would change so many lives. "I accept," she finally said with a simplicity that barely concealed her emotion. "For these children, I accept your generous offer, Your Grace." Armand nodded, satisfied. "Perfect. Dufresne will take care of the administrative details. You can move in as soon as the lodge has been put in order, a week at most." As the small group headed toward the village, Jules still carried on his improvised stretcher. The Duke walking alongside Claire, Armand de Montfaucon reflected on the strange detours of destiny. He had come this morning with the simple intention of settling a financial debt inherited from his uncle, an act of family honor that should have taken only a quarter of an hour of his time. Instead, he had discovered a much deeper debt, the one he had, without knowing it, to these neglected children of his domain. And even more, he had met a woman whose quiet courage and unwavering compassion had touched him in a way he would never have thought possible. As the sun began its descent over the valley, illuminating with a golden light the humble cottages of the hamlet, Armand found himself thinking that perhaps, for the first time in his life, he had found a true meaning for his title and his fortune. And all this because he had come to pay a poor widow and found her feeding half the valleys. Orphans' destiny, he mused with a slight smile, sometimes had strange ways of showing us the path.